This is John Phillips, Professor of Politics and Philosophy, and this is my take on writing persuasive essays for college and beyond. Today, I want to talk about introductions. Introductions, by definition, introduce the subject. But what does that mean? If you're making an argument, your introduction should say something about why the subject of the essay matters. That's not the same as just saying that it's important. You need to come up with reasons for your audience to care about the answer to the question you're addressing. So, for example, how you fill seats in a legislature has important effects on everything from the size of the welfare state to the rights of minorities. You're assuming that your audience might care a little about the size of the welfare state and the rights of various minority groups. If they care about those things, then how you fill seats in the legislature is important. So you know what the topic is, how to fill seats in the legislature, and your audience has some idea of why it's important. Now, once you've hopefully grabbed their interest, you should also give your audience an idea of what the possible answers to the question are. If there are many answers, you should try to group them into different sorts of answers. For example, there are many ways to fill seats in the parliament or in the legislature, through single-member districts, multi-member districts, and a single national district. If there are only two options, you could briefly choose to explain the reasons why some people prefer the option you do not prefer. For example, some people prefer systems of proportional representation because they have been shown to be correlated with high levels of social insurance and low levels of economic inequality. You've just introduced the view that's not your own, and you've given some motivation for those views. You've given some idea about why someone might believe that view. Once your reader has the lay of the land, you should then explain what your view is. That's your thesis statement. And then you should briefly outline your reasons for holding that position. And that's your argument. Let me give you another example. Systems of proportional representation are more likely a consequence of low levels of inequality and high levels of social trust than their cause. Until such levels of trust are achieved, constituent representation is the surest way of ensuring that individuals in a particular geographic area will not be ignored. So what you've done here is you've presented the reasons why you take the position against proportional representation and in favor of something else, like district representation. In this case, you've said that rather than favoring lower levels of inequality and higher levels of social trust, proportional representations are more a reflection of those already existing underlying values. Now, your introduction doesn't lay out the whole argument. It just lays out an outline of the argument. Obviously, we're going to need some evidence in this instance that social trust is a cause and not a product of the electoral system. We will also need some reasons to think that proportional representation does not represent geographic areas very well, or that it cannot, when the inhabitants in different regions do not trust each other. And we also have to show that single-member districts do better. On top of all of this, we're going to need to make sure that there aren't other reasons to prefer proportional representation that should be considered. So, considerations of representation, for example. And of course, making this case is going to be the job of the rest of the paper. In fact, you should think about your paper as making good on the promises that you make in the introduction. So, there you have it. You have four main tasks to accomplish in your introduction. 1, give a sense of why the topic matters. 2, explain different positions on the issue. 3, give a thesis statement. And 4, explain what your reasons are for believing that thesis statement. If you do that, you'll be on your way to a persuasive paper. Now, I think it's reasonable to ask yourself why you should do these things. Why not just go ahead and produce the argument without these preliminaries? For one, I think there's a question of social expectations that cannot be ignored. People expect you to let them know what you're doing when you're reading their work. If you don't, they're going to be confused. You should want to be understood and not confuse your readers, and so keeping up with a social convention will do that. If they didn't expect it, if they expected something else, then they perhaps wouldn't be confused, but to the extent that they expect it, you should give it to them. But beyond that, we can ask why this particular social convention rather than some other. So perhaps we can imagine a social convention where essays, college essays, were written like mystery stories, where the author's thesis is only revealed at the end in a grand finale. I think the reason why we don't do that has to do with the fact that arguments are often complicated and subtle things, and your reader will want some way to anticipate what's coming without losing the thread of the argument. Now, very talented writers can write without losing their audience, but ordinary writers may not have that skill. And so if the audience knows what's supposed to be coming, that is to say they've been given a preview of what the argument is, that's going to make it easier for them to follow the thread of the argument throughout the paper. For example, it's going to explain to them why in one particular paragraph such and such a piece of evidence is being brought up, or why such and such a moral principle is being applied in a given situation. They'll know why you're doing what you're doing because they already have some idea of where you're going and how you're going to get there. There is also probably the small matter of not wasting your audience's time. Now, I'm paid to read college essays, but many times your essays will be for one audience and not another. And your reader would like to know fairly quickly whether or not they are part of the target audience. So a brief introduction of the sort I just mentioned can fulfill that purpose of letting a reader know relatively quickly whether or not they want to read the rest of the paper or continue on with their research. So, there you have it. How can you, and why should you, introduce the subject of your essay before you dive right on in? I had a professor once in graduate school who said that he could grade a paper simply by reading the introduction, because the introduction contained all the information that he needed to know to figure out whether the student was well versed in the subject that they were examining. Now, I think that's probably a slight exaggeration, but a good introduction sets up the foundation of a great paper, and a poor introduction often signals problems that they're going to plague the entire paper. If you want to learn more about politics and philosophy, or about how to write college essays, please subscribe to my channels.